The stampede came through at dawn, and by the time I reached the boundary post the dust had already settled into the high mountain air like flour shaken from a cloth. I had heard it from the lower ridge, that deep, rolling percussion you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears, and I had known immediately what it was. The Velketh Highland Preserve does not produce small sounds. When something moves inside it, the whole mountain knows. I came up the access trail at a run, which is not something a man of 41 does gracefully on a grade of 1 in 4. By the time I cleared the tree line and got the post in sight, I was breathing harder than I liked, and my right knee was reminding me of a fall I had taken 6 years ago on a survey run in the Carath lowlands. I noted the complaint and kept moving. The scene at the boundary marker was not what I expected. I had expected, at most, a displaced herd animal or two testing the fence line. The preserve's outer boundary is rated for Category 6 pressure, which means it is rated for the weight of a Velketh Hill strider in full territorial aggression. It is not rated for a stampede of 112 of them moving in the same direction at the same moment. The eastern fence section was down for 60 meters. The gate mechanism had seized. The emergency contact panel on the post wall was showing 3 amber fault lights and one that had gone entirely dark. None of that was what held my attention. She was sitting against the base of the boundary marker post with her back straight and her hands flat on her thighs and her left leg at an angle that no leg should make below the knee. The bone-white rank threading in her close-cropped dark hair was matted with dust. Her uniform, the deep gray and black of Velketh's sovereign field dress, was torn at the right shoulder. She was looking at the open gap in the fence, and her pale amber eyes had the quality of something that has been focused on a single point for so long that the focus has become the whole of the world. I had seen her before. Every boundary ranger in the Velketh Highland sector knew Queen Vithi Sorn by sight. She made inspection tour of the outer territories twice per standard year, which was twice more than any sovereign before her, and she did them in field dress rather than court attire, which the court apparently considered irregular and the rangers considered simply practical. I had exchanged maybe 40 words with her across 3 inspection visits. She was precise, observational, and not interested in ceremony. I had respected her without giving it much thought, the way you respect a well-made tool. I had not known she was here today. There had been no advance notification, which meant this had not been a scheduled visit. Her 2 children were not with her. I knew she had twins because the inspection visit 2 seasons ago had included a brief, unscheduled stop at the lower preserve boundary where the children, I had been told they were 6 years old, standard reckoning, had asked me 4 questions about the fence pressure sensors in rapid succession, and then run off along the trail ahead of their mother's security detail at a speed that suggested the security detail was going to have a difficult afternoon. They had been wearing small versions of field dress. They had the same pale amber eyes as their mother and the same quality of attention, already, at 6 years old. The kind of attention that registers everything and gives nothing back until it has decided what it wants to do with what it has registered. I looked at the gap in the fence. I looked at the single set of adult tracks in the dust at the margin, heading back toward the access path. The Queen's security detail, or what remained of it after the stampede, had run for the transit relay at the lower post, I assumed, to call for Velketh military support. Standard protocol. The correct call if you are following protocol. And then I looked at the 2 small sets of tracks that led through the gap and into the preserve. "How long?" I said. She did not look at me. 40 minutes. Were they running, or were they carried in by the herd? A pause. The quality of it told me she had been asking herself the same question for 40 minutes. Running. I saw them go. Her voice was even. The evenness cost her something. I could hear the cost even if I could not have named exactly what it was. The stampede split around the post. They ran for the gap before I could reach them. I took the impact from a strider's shoulder at the fence line. She did not look at her leg. My detail lead has gone for support. Transit relay response from the Velketh garrison is 1 hour and 40 minutes minimum. And from the compact emergency station, 2 hours and 10. I did the arithmetic. It was not arithmetic that produced a reassuring answer. The Highland Preserve at Category 6 pressure containment houses, at current census, 112 Velketh hill striders. They are not predators in the conventional sense. They are territorial herd animals that weigh between 400 and 600 kilograms each and move at considerable speed when disturbed. A stampede that large, moving through their own territory, would produce a disturbance cascade. Every other species in the preserve, the ridgeback stalkers, the gray flank climbers, the burrow horns that nest in the upper escarpment, would be moving in response to the hill strider run. The interior of the preserve right now was the inside of an alarm that had been going off for 40 minutes and had not stopped. 6-year-old children, Velketh physiology, unaccompanied. The numbers were not good, and I did not pretend they were good. I went to the post storage locker and took out the equipment I kept there. The long-range locator beacon that could ping a Velketh biosignature, the trail medical kit, the contact deterrent charges, 12 of them, each rated for a single hill strider at close range, and the terrain map of the preserve interior that I had updated by hand each quarter for 3 years because the compact's automated system was consistently 6 months behind actual migration patterns. I spread the terrain map on the flat top of the boundary post. I looked at the gap in the fence. I looked at the small tracks, children running from a sound they did not understand from the direction of the fence gap into the preserve. They would have moved away from the sound, which meant north and slightly west, following the natural drainage channel that runs along the base of the first escarpment. The channel offers cover. 6-year-olds in flight would take the path of most cover instinctively. I had walked that channel in every season for 3 years. I knew where it widened, where it narrowed, where it met the secondary rise. I also knew where the gray flank climbers nested at the top of the secondary rise, and where the ridgeback stalkers had moved their territory marker 2 seasons ago, and exactly which stretch of the channel floor had burrowhorn warrens that would send a vibration signal through the ground if anything heavier than 40 kilograms moved through it too quickly. I folded the terrain map and put it in my chest pocket. I checked the contact deterrent charges and distributed them across my belt, and checked the medical kit and sealed it against dust, and recalibrated the locator beacon for Velketh juvenile biosignature, which is a slightly different read than the adult signature. The bone density differential at that age produces a variant thermal profile. It took me 40 seconds. I had recalibrated that beacon enough times in training runs that my hands knew the sequence without my having to think about it. I looked at the Queen. She was still looking at the gap in the fence. She had not asked me what I was doing. She was, I thought, a person who had trained herself not to ask for things she did not believe she would receive. The drainage channel northwest, I said. That's where they'll have gone. The channel floor is soft, their tracks will hold. I'll have a biosignature read within the first quarter kilometer once I'm through the gap. She turned her head and looked at me. Full attention, amber eyes clear as water over pale stone. Whatever she had been managing internally since the stampede, she set it aside and looked at me with the full precision of someone whose entire function requires reading a situation accurately on very little information. I had been looked at by superior officers and by frightened civilians and by alien wildlife that was deciding whether I constituted a threat. The quality of her attention was none of those things. It was the look of a person, deciding whether what they were seeing could be trusted to do what it appeared to be about to do. "You are the boundary ranger," she said. "Yes." "You have no standing authorization for interior preserve response. That requires Velketh military certification." "That's right. The military response will arrive in 1 hour and 40 minutes. "Yes." She held my eyes for a moment. I did not look away, and I did not explain myself further. There was nothing more to explain. 2 children had gone into the preserve 40 minutes ago, and I was the only person at the boundary who knew the interior terrain. She said, "The drainage channel has 4 ridge points where climbers shelter. The 3rd ridge point has an overhang. They will have shelter instinct. They will go to the overhang." She had walked this terrain on her inspection tour. She had looked at it the way I looked at it, as a system of choices and consequences. Of course she had. "I know the overhang," I said. "I'll start there." I went through the gap in the fence. The first 100 meters of the preserve interior are deceptively ordinary. The vegetation is the same gray-green highland scrub that covers the outer slopes, low, wind-formed, smelling of mineral dust, and the particular resin the scrub produces in dry conditions. The fence line disappears behind you quickly because the ground rises and the scrub closes in. Within 2 minutes of the gap you are in a different world than the boundary post, and the boundary post is already out of sight. I moved at a controlled pace. Not slow, I did not have the time to move slowly, but not running either, because running in unknown terrain is how you break an ankle, and a broken ankle inside the preserve was a different kind of arithmetic than the one I had already done. The biosignature beacon gave me a reading at 80 meters, 2 juvenile Velkoth signatures moving, nor-northwest as I had calculated. Distance, 430 meters. Moving slowly now, which meant they were not running but they were still on their feet. Good. I adjusted my bearing and kept moving. The first hill strider I encountered was at the 200-meter mark, standing broadside across the drainage channel, head low, ears flat. The post-stampede agitation makes them unpredictable. They do not return to territorial calm for at least 3 hours after a major run. This one was a large male. I estimated 550 kilograms. The full rack of secondary horn plates across the skull indicating a dominant tier animal. He had not seen me yet. I was downwind. I moved to the left margin of the channel against the escarpment face and went still. The hill strider raised its head and turned it slowly, reading the air. I did not breathe. 30 seconds, 40, 50. He moved off up the channel slope, unhurried, in the way of large animals that have decided the threat has not yet materialized into a certainty. I let out a breath and kept moving. The second and third hill striders I encountered together at the first ridge point, where the channel narrows between 2 rock faces. They were juveniles, 150 kilograms each, roughly, and juveniles separated from the herd after a stampede are far more dangerous than adults, because they have not yet developed the threat discrimination that comes with size and experience. They charge things that adults would simply observe and evaluate. The first one charged at 40 meters, which is about what I expected. I triggered a contact deterrent charge at 4 meters, which produces a sharp pressure wave at close range, enough to stop a juvenile without injuring it, not enough to do anything meaningful against an adult. The juvenile spun away with a high sound and ran up the ridge face. The second one watched its companion go, decided whatever it had decided, and followed. I moved through the narrows quickly and kept going. The terrain rises sharply at the second ridge point. The channel becomes a scramble here, loose shale over the base rock, with the occasional anchored boulder providing a handhold. I went up it the way I always went up it, choosing the same 3 footholds I had used on every quarterly survey run. My knee had a great deal to say about this. I told it, internally, that we could have a more detailed conversation at a time of its choosing, later. At the top of the second ridge point, I stopped and read the beacon. 2 juvenile Velkoth signatures, 310 meters, stationary. Stationary was good. Stationary meant they had found somewhere to stop. Stationary also meant they were not currently fleeing from something in an active way, which was the other possibility and a worse one. I looked at the terrain between me and the signal, the upper drainage channel, the flat section, the overhang approach, and between me and the flat section, a gray flank climber nesting area which I had marked on my hand-updated terrain map as active 2 months ago. Gray-flanked climbers do not typically attack large targets. They are ambush hunters that specialize in the preserve's mid-sized burrowing fauna, but typically carries a significant qualification when the entire preserve has been in disturbance cascade for the better part of an hour. Disturbed climbers that feel cornered will attack anything that comes too close to the nesting elevation, including things considerably larger than their usual prey category. I went wide around the nesting area, adding perhaps 300 meters to my route, climbing the outer ridge line to get above the nesting elevation, then dropping back down on the far side. It cost me 12 minutes. I noted the time and recalculated. 2 hours from the start of the crisis had been the military response window. I was already 1 hour and 20 minutes in. It did not matter. I kept moving. On the far side descent from the outer ridge, I crossed another group of hill striders, 4 of them, mid-sized, moving in the herd recombination pattern that follows a stampede, drifting back toward their territorial anchor points on instinct. The herd recombination pattern is not aggressive. It is purposeful, which is different. An animal moving with purpose is predictable. I read their direction drift, calculated their next 40 seconds of movement, and waited on the high ground until they passed below me, then moved down and behind them on the diagonal. 4 minutes lost, but no contact required and no deterrent charges expended. The beacon signal strengthened as I came down the far side. At 250 meters, I paused at a natural break in the scrub to assess the approach. The flat section below the climber nesting area had 3 adult hill striders moving through it, widely spaced, not agitated, just displaced, looking for familiar ground the way all herd animals look for familiar ground after a disruption of this scale. I could thread between them if I timed the gaps correctly, and moved at the pace that registers to large herd animals as non-threat. The particular walking speed that falls below the aggression trigger threshold, which I had learned from 3 years of quarterly surveys, and which is slower than instinct wants you to move when you are trying to cover ground quickly. I timed the gaps, I moved at the correct pace, I moved through. On the other side of the flat section, at 150 meters and stationary, I heard the first sound, a high, thin sound that a person unfamiliar with it might not have identified, but that I recognized. Velkoth children make a specific sound when they have been frightened and have run out of running. A sustained, controlled exhalation through the nose that the physiological literature describes as a fear suppression vocalization. It is not crying. It is something older than crying, a sound that says I am still here, and I am making myself small, and I am waiting for something to change. I slowed down and moved with care. The overhang was exactly where I knew it to be, a granite shelf extending from the escarpment face, 3 meters deep, 2 meters of vertical clearance at the inner margin. The rock face behind it was dry. The floor of the overhang was deep dust, wind accumulated over years and soft underfoot. And in the back corner of it, pressed against the rock with their arms around each other, and the fear suppression vocalization coming from them both in near-perfect unison, were the Queen's 2 children. Identical in the way of twins, which is a specific kind of identical, not copies but 2 answers to the same question, each slightly different. The same pale amber eyes as their mother. The same close-cropped dark hair, shorter on one than the other. The same bone-white threading, thin at this age, just beginning, more suggestion than substance, but present, the lineage marking itself even here, even now, even in the back corner of a granite overhang after a stampede. They had their boots on still, and both of them were dusty, and the smaller one had a scrape along her jaw that had dried to a dark line against her slate-gray skin. When I came under the overhang and they saw me, both of them went silent and absolutely still. I stopped. I did not move further. I crouched down so I was at their eye level, which put me in an awkward position given the low clearance, but eye level matters when you are introducing yourself to frightened children in a small space. It says, I am not larger than you right now. It says, I am on your level, and I am not moving until you decide this is acceptable. My name is Rael, I said. I work at the boundary post. Your mother sent me. The first part was true. The second part was close enough to true that I did not examine it closely. The slightly shorter-haired one, I would learn later her name was Soren, said, without unclenching from her twin, "You're human." Yes. Humans aren't certified for interior preserve response. She had apparently paid close attention during the same inspection visit where I had exchanged 40 words with her mother. 6 years old, and she had retained the certification protocol. Their mother's children, as I had thought. That's right, I said. I'm not certified, I came anyway. A silence. The two of them looked at each other in the way of twins that need no words for the consultation. Then the other one, Vethi, I would learn, said, in a voice that had somewhat less control over itself than her sister's, "Is our mother all right?" "She's at the boundary post. She's hurt her leg. She's waiting for you." The particular quality of the pause that followed this told me what they had been carrying in the overhang for the past 45 minutes. They had not known, and the not knowing had been its own separate weight. Hurt leg, waiting. Alive. Present tense. "Can you walk?" I asked. "Yes," Soren said. "Vethi turned her ankle on the channel shale. She can walk, but it's slower." "All right, I want you to stay close to me. One on each side. If I stop, you stop. If I move, you move. If I tell you to get flat on the ground, you do it immediately without asking me why. You ask why later after we're through the gap." I looked at them both. "Do you understand?" "Yes," they said together, with the exact synchronized delivery of twins who have been answering questions jointly their entire lives. "Good," I stood up carefully. "Let's go." The route back was not the route I had taken coming in. The gray flank climbers were behind me now, between me and the long way around, and with 2 children moving at reduced pace, I could not afford the extra 12 minutes. I had to take the direct route through the flat section below the nesting area, and I had to do it quietly and quickly enough that we cleared the disturbance zone before any climbers investigated the movement. I briefed them as we moved, not in a way that would increase their fear. There was nothing to be gained by that, but practically in the language of the terrain. This section we walk at this pace. This is where we step and this is where we don't. Single file through the narrows. When I raise my right hand, you stop and go completely still. Both of them tracked everything I said and followed every instruction without complaint or hesitation. They had the ranger quality of moving in terrain, as though the terrain is a system to be read rather than a backdrop to be ignored. I do not know if that is a Velkith sovereign characteristic or a characteristic of their mother specifically, but it was there. We were through the flat section and past the nesting elevation before any climbers showed meaningful interest. One tracked us from the upper rock face. I heard its 3-note alert call, the territorial query sound rather than the attack precursor, but did not descend. I kept the children moving at steady pace and we cleared the zone. At the first ridge point narrows, the juvenile hillstriders from my inward pass were gone. The adult male was back in the lower channel but facing away, occupied with something in the scrub on the far bank. We went wide and passed him on the uphill side without triggering his attention. At the second ridge point scramble, I carried Vethi up on my back because the loose shale was worse going down than coming up and her turned ankle would not hold the grade safely. She held on without being asked to and did not make a sound the entire way up. When I set her down at the top and she tested her weight on the ankle and found it manageable, she looked at me with her mother's direct amber eyes and said, with complete composure, "Thank you." Not performed composure. Real composure. A child who had learned from someone that gratitude stated plainly is better than gratitude performed at length. The beacon was telling me we were 200 meters from the boundary gap when the last significant problem presented itself. It was not a hill strider. It was a ridgeback stalker, the the species that had moved its territory marker 2 seasons ago into the eastern section of the channel approaches, which I had documented and submitted to the Compact Wildlife Registry, and which had not yet been updated in the official terrain maps, because the official terrain maps were 6 months behind reality. I had been filing update requests for that lag for 18 months. This was the consequence of an 18-month filing delay standing in front of me in the form of 90 kilograms of dedicated ambush predator, with its full attention on Vethi. Ridgeback stalkers are not herd animals, and they are not juveniles susceptible to contact deterrent. When they target lock, they do not break off for convenience. The ankle injury was producing a movement irregularity that registered as prey signal to the stalker's targeting instinct. At 30 meters, parallel to our line of travel, keeping its angle, I had seen it come out of the scrub, and I had done the calculation before it finished taking its first parallel step. I had 3 contact deterrent charges left. They would not stop a ridgeback stalker. What I had was the terrain and 3 years of reading it, and what I had was the knowledge that a ridgeback stalker, once it commits to a charge, has a fixed approach trajectory and a fixed first strike vector, and that the first strike vector can be redirected if the target changes its spatial relationship to the charge angle in the last fraction of a second. "Stop," I said. Both children stopped. "Soren, take your sister's hand. Walk directly toward the fence gap at the steady pace I showed you. Do not run. Do not look at the scrub to your left. Count your steps out loud as you go in your own language. I want to hear the count." Soren looked at me. Those amber eyes understood the geometry of what I was proposing. She was 6 years old and she understood. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," I said. "Go." She took Vethi's hand. I heard the count begin, quiet and steady, in Velkith, the low-register counting form they use for procedural tasks, not the high form for ceremony. They walked. I turned to face the scrub. The ridgeback stalker and I observed each other across 30 meters of highland scrub for approximately 4 seconds. It had redirected its attention from the moving targets that had walked away to the stationary target that had stayed. That was the whole of the plan. Give it a stationary target more interesting than the moving ones. When it charged, it covered the 30 meters in about 2 seconds. I triggered all 3 remaining contact deterrent charges simultaneously at 4 meters. The pressure wave at 3 charges simultaneous is not rated for a ridgeback stalker and did not stop it. What it did was alter the angle of the charge trajectory by roughly 20 degrees, which was enough that the stalker's first strike momentum carried its shoulder into me rather than its strike appendages. I went down under the impact. 90 kilograms at full velocity is a significant force even at a redirected angle, and rolled to the right, putting the escarpment rock at my back because the rock meant the stalker could not get behind me, and behind is where ridgeback stalkers finish their engagements. What followed was approximately 90 seconds of the most focused activity I have ever performed in my life. I am not going to describe it as heroic because it did not feel heroic from the inside. It felt like a series of extremely rapid decisions, most of which proved correct, made by a person running on adrenaline and the specific competence of 3 years of studying a species I had never expected to be in close contact with but had studied thoroughly anyway, because thoroughness is not optional in boundary work. Every quarter I had read the updated species data on ridgeback stalkers. Every quarter I had noted the territory migration in my hand-updated map. I had spent 3 years learning a terrain I expected to only ever observe from the boundary. None of that time had been wasted. The ridgeback stalker's behavioral response to an engagement that produces unexpected and sustained resistance is retreat. They do not consider sunk costs. When the cost exceeds the expected return, they leave and find a different target. That is not cowardice in the animal sense. It is efficient predation logic. Energy conserved is energy available for the next engagement. After 90 seconds, The cost had exceeded the expected return for this particular engagement, and the stalker went back into the scrub from which it had come. I noted the exact location where it re-entered the vegetation for the contact report I would file tonight. My left arm was torn from wrist to elbow, not deeply, but considerably, in 3 parallel lines from the strike appendage that had connected before the deterrent charges altered the trajectory. 2 of my ribs had made a sound during the initial impact that I had not liked and could not ignore. I pressed my right hand against the arm wound and walked toward the fence gap. The children were already through. I came through the gap and they were standing on the far side, Soren holding Vethai's hand, both of them looking at me. They had waited. I had told them to keep walking and they had waited anyway, and I decided this was not the moment to have a conversation about that. Queen Vethai Sorn was where I had left her. She had not moved. In the 1 hour and 48 minutes that I had been inside the preserve, she had not moved from the base of the boundary marker post. I understood why in the practical sense. There is no comfortable position for a shattered leg at a wrong angle, and moving creates the risk of moving incorrectly. An incorrect movement on a shattered leg is a category of problem that compounds other problems. Stillness was the medically correct decision. But I think there was more to it than the medical correctness of it. I think she had chosen not to move because moving felt, in some way she would not have named, like a form of giving up on the thing she was waiting for. She had stayed exactly where the children had last seen her. If they came back when they came back, she would be where they expected to find her. That is not a rational decision. It is the decision of a mother who has 1 hour and 48 minutes to sit with the arithmetic of what has gone wrong, and whose only available action is to be present in the last known location. I had thought about her in the preserve. Not at length. I did not have the attention to spare for anything that was not the terrain and the animals and the beacon signal. But in the brief still moments, the 30 seconds behind the escarpment rock while the adult male strider read the air, the 4 seconds of eye contact with the ridgeback stalker while the children walked away, she had been there in the background of my thinking, a fixed point. Back straight, eyes on the gap. Holding something with both hands and not setting it down. She heard them before she saw them. I think she heard the count, which Vethai was still doing quietly under her breath, the Velkith procedural form, and her head turned. And then Soren came around the post and said "Ma" in a voice that had entirely given up on composure, and both of them ran the last 5 meters, and the queen opened her arms. I stopped walking. I stood at the boundary gate and I watched. She held both children against her with a force that said something words would have made smaller. Her composure, which she had maintained for 1 hour and 48 minutes across a shattered leg and a disappearance, and the certain knowledge that no mechanisms were available to her for fixing what needed to be fixed, that composure came apart. Not loudly, not dramatically. It came apart in the way of something that has been held under significant pressure for a long time. A single long exhalation, and then the tears, and they were not the tears of a person performing grief, but of a person who has been relieved of a weight they had not been entirely certain they could keep carrying. Her back stayed straight. Even now, the composure was not entirely gone. It had transformed rather than collapsed, become something that could hold grief and relief in the same space without either one obliterating the other. She pressed her face against Soren's hair, and she pressed it against Vethai's, and she wept over both of them at once, and her children held on to her and did not let go. I stood at the gate. There is something about witnessing a moment like that, private, enormous, belonging entirely to the people inside it, that requires a specific kind of stillness from whoever is on the outside. You do not announce yourself. You do not interrupt. You wait because the moment is not yours, and the most useful thing you can do is be present without demanding to be acknowledged. I was good at waiting. Boundary work makes you good at waiting. You learn to hold stillness the way you hold the correct footing on loose shale, not rigid, but grounded, weight distributed properly, ready to move when movement is required and content to remain still when it is not. So I stood there. My arm bled quietly through the pressure of my right hand. My ribs made their case. The high mountain air came down off the escarpment the way it always did in the mid-morning, cool and clean, and carrying the mineral scent of the highland scrub resin. The dust of the stampede was settling back into the track margins. Somewhere in the preserve behind me, the hill striders were slowly, herd by herd, drifting back toward territorial calm. It took some time. I did not measure it. At some point, Soren looked up from her mother's shoulder and looked at me. Her pale amber eyes were wet, and there was dust in her hair, and her ankle was swollen in a way that would need attention. But her face had the quality of a child who has processed everything that has happened to them in the past 2 hours and found, on the other side of it, solid ground. She said nothing to me. She looked, and then she looked back at her mother. Then Vethai looked at me the same way, and she said quietly over her mother's shoulder, "Thank you, Ranger." The Queen raised her head. She looked at her children first, ran her hands over both of them with the deliberate, systematic attention of a person conducting a field assessment, found the turned ankle, found the scrape on Vethai's jaw, checked the dust and the scrub scratches and the small tear in Soren's sleeve. When she was satisfied that the damage was real but survivable, she looked up. At me. I had been looked at by a lot of people across a lot of years. I have a reasonable sense of what most categories of attention feel like. I can identify gratitude and relief and calculation and the particular look of a person deciding whether to trust what they are seeing. I can identify the look of someone who has been surprised by something and is working out where to put the surprise. This was not any of those categories. It was the look of a person for whom something has been confirmed that they had considered possible, but had not yet let themselves believe. It was precise and complete, and it did not look away. It went into the part of me that keeps an accurate count of things, the part that reads terrain and updates maps and files the same request 18 times because the request is correct, and correctness does not expire. And it registered there, quietly and without ceremony, as a fact now entered in the record. She looked at my left arm. "You're injured," she said. "Torn," I said. "Ridgeback stalker on the channel approach. It'll need cleaning, but it's not structural. The ribs are more of a conversation." I heard myself apply the word conversation to cracked ribs and thought this was possibly the most understated sentence I had produced all day. "Ribs," she said. "Two, I think. Cracked rather than broken. The stalker's shoulder on the initial impact. The contact deterrence redirected the charge but didn't stop it." She held my eyes again, and then she said, with a precision that I would think about for some time afterward, "How many?" I did not need to ask what she meant. 12 animal contacts going in. 1 adult male strider, 2 juveniles at the first narrows gray flank climber zone passage, 3 more strider encounters on the East Channel approach, a territorial group at the secondary ridge, 2 more adults near the flat section. Coming out with the children, juvenile striders again, the adult in the main channel, the climber zone on the direct route, 1 additional territorial group on the approach. The stalker at the boundary approach. She had been counting while I listed them. That is not 100. The preserve census is 112 hill striders. I did not personally encounter every one of them. The corner of her mouth moved. It was the smallest possible movement. "No," she said, "I suppose you did not." Then she said my name. Not the way people say a name when they are trying to get your attention, or when they want to ask you something, or when they are marking you in a category for later retrieval. She said it the way the Velketh formal acknowledgement functions. I knew it from the registry documentation, from the sections of the compact Velketh bilateral accord that cover formal recognition protocols. The Velsorath form, the giving of a name back to the person as proof that it has been received and held. She said it in compact standard, which is not the natural language for that form, but the weight was there regardless. The weight does not live in the language. It lives in the intent behind the speaking, and the intent was precise and clear, and did not require translation. "Rail Doven," she said. I was, for a moment, not entirely certain what to do with it. I am not a person who responds to being precisely seen with any particular fluency. I have spent enough years in isolated postings, 3 years at this boundary, 2 before it at the Lower Kareth Survey Station, 4 more before that in positions I had chosen specifically because they required sustained solitary attention rather than sustained social navigation. That when recognition lands not as a category or a function, but as the specific person, it tends to catch me somewhere in the region of the sternum and stay there longer than I expect it to. This was that. This was exactly that. "Yes," I said. Which was, in retrospect, exactly the right answer. She nodded, and her amber eyes did not move from mine, and she did not appear to require anything more elaborate from me than the confirmation that I was present and had heard my name and understood what the giving of it meant. Her children were still leaning against her, one on each side, Vethai's swollen ankle resting on the flat stone, Soren's torn sleeve moving in the highland wind. In the distance, down the access trail, I could hear the first sounds of the Velkith military response arriving, the low hum of transport vehicles, the crackle of communication equipment, the specific organized sound of a detail that has pushed its transit time and is deploying fast, 43 minutes ahead of the estimate. They had pushed hard, and they had been too late, and that was not a failure on their part, and it was not a success on mine. It was simply the arithmetic of distance and response time, and a drainage channel that ran nor-northwest, and a granite overhang I had surveyed 4 times per year for 3 years. I lowered myself carefully to the ground. My ribs had strong opinions about this that I acknowledged without acting on their preferred course of action, which would have been to not move at all, and sat with my back against the fence post with my legs in front of me and my right hand still applying pressure to my left arm. The highland air was still clean. The dust had mostly settled. "The military medics will be here in 8 minutes, I said. "Your leg needs stabilization before any transport. The children should be assessed for exposure response and Vethai's ankle will need imaging." "Yes," she said. "I'll file the internal preserve contact report when the arm is dealt with. The Ridgeback Stalker territory migration needs to go into the official registry update. I've been flagging it for 2 seasons. I will ensure it is prioritized," she said. And then, after a brief pause, in the same even voice but with something underneath it that had not been there before, "The registry update and the fence repair assessment and the additional resource request for the census run. I have seen all 3 filings. They will be acted on." I looked at her, she looked at me. The children were watching this exchange with the focused attention of people who have decided this is important and are storing it carefully. "Thank you," I said. A pause. Then Soren said, from her mother's side, with the specific pragmatic efficiency of a child who has survived something significant and is already looking at what comes next, "Ranger Rail, next time we come for inspection, will you show us where the gray flank climbers nest?" Her mother made a sound. It was very soft, and it was not quite a laugh, and it was not quite still crying, and it was somewhere in the territory between the two where the real things live. She pressed her face briefly into her daughter's hair. When she raised it again, her eyes were still wet at the margins, and her composure was still in the process of reassembling itself. But there was something in her expression that I would have called, if I had been required to use a word, settled. Something that had been uncertain had arrived at its correct position. "Yes," I said to Soren, "if your mother agrees." "She'll agree," Soren said, with considerable confidence. I looked at the Queen. The Queen looked at me. "Yes," Vethai, Soren said, "she will." The military transports came up the access trail and the medics came out at a run, moving toward the boundary post. I sat where I was and let them come. My arm continued to have opinions. My ribs had quieted somewhat, which either meant I had been wrong about 2 cracked ribs or meant I had stopped paying them the attention they required. The mountain was still there, and the preserve behind its damaged fence was settling back into itself, and Soren and Vethi Sorn were alive and with their mother had said my name and meant it to be heard. The medic who reached me first, a Velkith military field surgeon with the rank threading of someone who had been doing this a long time, crouched beside me and looked at my arm with the professional expression that tells you nothing about the assessment. He began the cleaning protocol without ceremony, which I appreciated. "You went in alone," he said after a moment. "Yes." He processed this. "You're human." "Yes." He looked at the torn arm. He looked at the access path leading to the gap in the fence. He looked back at me with an expression that had arrived at a conclusion it found simultaneously obvious and improbable. How many animal contacts? I thought about the Queen's question, which had been the same question, and about the corner of her mouth. "Some," I said. He made a sound that, in a different context, might have been a laugh, and kept working. Around us, the military detail was setting up the stabilization equipment for the Queen's leg and the assessment station for the children. Soren was already asking the equipment technician precise questions about the imaging unit's operational parameters. Vethi was holding her mother's hand and watching her sister with the expression of someone who has decided that, since Soren is going to ask those questions regardless, the most efficient use of their own energy is to wait for the answers. The Queen's eyes found mine over the children's heads. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We held each other's gaze for one moment, long enough for the fact of it to settle into the record we were both keeping, and then she looked back at her children, and I looked back at the medic's work on my arm, and the Highland morning moved around us the way it always did. There was a great deal of work still to be done. The fence assessment and the census run and the 18-month registry filing that would now, apparently, be acted on. The terrain map needed updating again after today. The contact report would take most of an evening to write properly, and it should be written properly, because accurate records are the foundation of everything that follows them. I looked at the preserve. The Highland wind came down off the escarpment through the scrub in the long, slow way it always did, and the mountain was what it had always been, and I thought that was exactly enough.